Hello and welcome back to another episode of Montgomery City County Public Library's Classics Cut. We today will be reading one of our favorite sci-fi novels, and as you can see, some of us know where our towels are. So, with that in mind, we will be kicking things off with Douglas Adams' The Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles, it's an utter insignificant little blue-green planet whose 8 descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole it wasn't small green pieces of paper that were actually unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place, and some said that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should ever have left the oceans. And then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickman's Worth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right. It would work, and no one would ever have to get nailed to anything again. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story. But it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earth man. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book to ever come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard of either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Ulan Kulabid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway? In many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom. For though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and second, it has the words, "Don't Panic," inscribed in large, friendly letters on its cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book begins very simply. It begins with the house. Chapter 1. The house stood on a slight rise just on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of West Country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one that he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him the most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was too. Most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night, it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, and the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear, and it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily around his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so scrub. Shaving mirror pointing at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment, it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee. Yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect it with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off to the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it at great length, he rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he had just found out about. He had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Prosser was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat, and shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though, he didn't know it. He was also a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible Mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left of Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry were a pronounced stoutness and about the turn, and a predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was nervous. He was a worried man. Today, he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. "Come off it, Mr. Dent," he said. "You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely." He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. "I'm game," he said. "We'll see who rusts first." "I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it," said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it around the top of his head. "This bypass has got to be built, and it's going to be built." "First I've heard of it," said Arthur. "Why's it got to be built?" Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him, then stopped and put it away again. "What do you mean, why's it got to be built?" he said. "It's a bypass! You've got to build bypasses!" Bypasses are devices that allow some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, while other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly between, are often to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there, and what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wish that people would just once and for all work out where the hell they wanted to be. Mr. Posser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular. It was just any convenient point a very long way from point A, B, and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D with access over the door and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why, he just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously, somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Posser said, "You were quite entitled to make any suggestions or protests at the appropriate time, you know." Appropriate time, hooted Arthur. Appropriate time? The first time I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my home yesterday. I asked him if he'd come to clean the windows, and he said no, he came to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh, no. First he wiped a couple of windows and charged me a $5. Then he told me. Mr. Dent, the plans have been available at the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh, yes, well, as soon as I heard of it, I went straight round to see them yesterday afternoon. You haven't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anybody or anything? But the plans were on display. On display. I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the display department. With a flashlight. Ah, well, the lights had probably gone out. So had the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you? Yes, said Arthur. Yes, I did. It was on a display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet stuck in a disused lavatory with a sign on the door saying, "Beware of the leopard." A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay propped up on his elbow in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at it. "It's not as if it's a particularly nice house," he said. "I'm sorry, but I happen to like it." "You like the bypass?" "Oh, shut up," said Arthur Dent. "Shut up and go away, and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on, and you know it." Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times while his mind was, for a moment, filled with the inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur Dent himself running, screaming from the blazing ruin, with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Prosser was often bothered with visions like these, and had made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment, and then pulled himself together. "Mr. Dent," he said. "Hello? Yes." "Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage that bulldozer would suffer if I just let it roll straight over you?" "How much?" said Arthur. "None at all," said Mr. Prosser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen, all shouting at him. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and not from Guildford as he had originally claimed. Arthur Dent had never, ever suspected this. This friend of his had arrived on the planet Earth some 15 Earth years previously, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society, with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder, though, because he skimped a bit on his preparatory speech. The information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Prefect as being nicely inconspicuous. He was not conspicuously tall, his features were striking but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was wiry and gingerish and brushed backward from the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled backward from the nose. There was something very slightly odd about him, but it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and when you talked to him for any length of time, your eyes began to voluntarily water on his behalf. Perhaps it was that he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he made on Earth as a bit of an eccentric, but a harmless one. An unruly boozer with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gatecrash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making friends with any astrophysicist he could find till he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily for a moment, relax, and grin. "Oh, just looking for flying saucers," he would joke. And everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucers he was looking for. "Green ones," he would reply with a wicked grin, laughing wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge for the nearest bar and buy an enormous round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull on whiskey, huddle in a corner with some girl and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the color of the flying saucers didn't matter that much. Thereafter, staggering semi-paralytic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew their way to Beetlejuice. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's about time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, but I'm trying to," is what Ford would invariably reply with on these occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was because that green was the traditional space livery of the Beetlejuice Trading Scouts. Ford Prefect was desperate to find any flying saucer at all that would arrive soon because 15 years was a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-bogglingly dull as Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get lifts from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than $30 Altarian a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with the occasional new ploy, such as the For the Public Good talk, or the March of Progress talk, or the They knocked my house down once, you know, never looked back talk, and various other cajoleries and threats. And it was the bulldozer driver's accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out, and the mud that Arthur lay on. A shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up, and squinting into the sun, was startled to see Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford! Hello! How are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've just got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of because they'll knock down my house if I don't. But other than that, well, not especially." "Why?" They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice. And Ford Prefect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds, Ford seemed to ignore him and stared fixedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then he suddenly squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine, okay, talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now, we'll go to the pub at the village." He looked into the sky again, nervous, expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock my house down!" Ford glanced at him, puzzled.
"Well, he can do it while you're away, can't he?"
asked. "But I don't want him to!"
"Oh,
"Look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur.
nothing. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to tell you in the saloon bar of the Horse and Groom.
"But why?"
Because you're going to need a very stiff drink."
Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that this was because of an old drinking game that Ford learned to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Mandronite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestling, and was played like this. 2 contestants would sit on either side of a table with a glass in front of each of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of Jenks Spirit, immortalized as the ancient Orion mining song, "Oh, don't give me none more of that old Jenks Spirit. No, don't you give me none more of that old Jenks Spirit, for my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old Jenks Spirit?" Each of the 2 contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour it into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again and again. Once you started to lose, you would probably keep losing because one of the effects of Jenks Spirit is to depress telepsychic power. As soon as a predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. "But what about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked over to Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him.
"He wants to knock down your house, right?"
"Yes, he wants to build..."
"And he can't because you're lying in front of his bulldozer, right?"
"Yes, and..."
"I'm sure we can come to an agreement." "Excuse me!"
Ford shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with a spokesperson for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard, and how much they should get paid for it if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had company. "Yes, hello. Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet?"
"Can we, for the moment, assume that he hasn't?"
"Well," sighed Mr. Prosser.
Can we assume that he's going to be staying here all day?"
"So?"
"So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing?"
"Could be.
"Well, if you're resigned to doing that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you?"
"What?"
"You don't," said Ford patiently. "Actually need him here, right?"
Mr. Prosser thought about this. "Well, no, not as such. Not exactly need." Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. And Ford said, "So if you would just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off to the pub for, say, half an hour. How does that sound?" Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure.
"And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on, we can always cover you in return."
"Well, thank you very much," said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. Thank you very much, yes, that's very kind." He frowned, then he smiled. Then he tried to do both at once, failed, grasped hold of his fur hat, and rolled it fitfully around the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won.
"So," continued Ford Prefect, "if you would just like to come over here and lie down."
"Huh?" said Mr. Prosser.
I'm sorry. Perhaps I hadn't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lie in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them from getting into Mr. Dent's house, will there? Huh? Said Mr. Prosser again. It's very simple. My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come and take over for him.
What are you talking about? Said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. You want me, said Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, to come lie there,
Yes,
in front of the bulldozer,
yes,
instead of Mr. Dent,
yes.
in the mud.
In, as you say, the mud.
As soon as Mr. Prosser realized that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a weight lifted right off of his shoulders. This was more like the world as he knew it. He sighed. In return for which you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub.
That's it. That's it exactly.
Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. Promise? He said.
Promise, said Ford.
He turned to Arthur.
Come on,
He said to him.
get up and let the man lie down.
Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Mr. Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly, sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life had been some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were actually enjoying it. The mud folded itself around his bottom and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely.
And no sneaky knocking Mr. Dent's house down while he's away, all right?
The mere thought, growled Mr. Prosser, hadn't even begun to speculate, he continued, settling himself back, about the merest possibility of crossing my mind. He saw the bulldozer drivers' union representative approaching and let his head sink back and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noises, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable or put upon, and he had never been able to explain to himself as to why. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids. Bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in the mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliation, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day. What a day. Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingo's kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not now. Arthur remained very worried. But can we trust him? He said.
Myself, I'd trust him to the end of the earth, said Ford.
Oh, yes, said Arthur. And how far is that?
About 12 minutes away, said Ford. Come on, I need a drink.
Here's what the Encyclopedia Galactica has to say about alcohol. It says that alcohol is a colorless volatile liquid formed by the fermentation of sugars and also notes its intoxicating effect on certain carbon-based life forms. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy also mentions alcohol. It says that the best drink in existence is the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. It says that the effect of drinking a Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster is like having your brain smashed out by a slice of lemon wrapped around a large gold brick. The guide also tells you on which planets the best Pan-Galactic Gargle Blasters are mixed, how much you can expect to pay for one, and what voluntary organizations exist to help you rehabilitate afterward. The guide even tells you how you can mix one yourself. Take the juice from one bottle of the old Jack spirit, it says, pour it into 1 measure of water from the seas of Santraginus 5. Oh, that's Sanguinian sea water, it says. Oh, those Santragian fish. Allow 3 cubes of Arcturian megagen to melt into the mixture. It must be properly iced or the benzene is lost. Allow 4 liters of Fallian marsh gas to bubble through it, in memory of all those happy hikers who have died of pleasure in the marshes of failure. Over the back of a silver spoon float a measure of qualactin hypermint extract, redolent of all the heady odors of the dark qualactin zones, subtle, sweet, and mystic. Drop in the tooth of an Algolian sun tiger. Watch it dissolve, spreading the fires of the Algolian suns deep into the heart of the drink. Sprinkle samphire, add an olive, drink, but very carefully. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sells rather better than the Encyclopedia Galactica. 6 pints better, said Ford Prefect to the barman of the Horse and Groom. Hey, quickly, please, the world's about to end. The barman of the Horse and Groom didn't deserve this sort of treatment. He was a dignified old man. He pushed his glasses up his nose and blinked at Ford Prefect. Ford ignored him and stared out the window, so the barman looked instead at Arthur, who shrugged helplessly and said nothing. So the barman said, "Oh yes, sir. See, nice weather for it," and started pulling pints. He tried again. "Gonna watch the match this afternoon then?" Ford glanced round at him. No point," he said, and looked back out the window. "What's that, foregone conclusion then, you reckon, sir?" said the barman. "Arsenal without a chance?" No, said Ford. "It's just that the world's about to end." Oh, yes, sir, so you said the barman, looking over his glasses this time at Arthur. "Look, lucky escape for Arsenal if it did." Ford looked back at him, really surprised. "No, not really," he said. He frowned. The barman breathed in heavily. "There you are, sir, 6 points," he said. Arthur smiled at him wanly and shrugged again. He turned and smiled wanly at the rest of the pub, just in case any of them had heard what was going on. None of them had, and none of them could understand what he was smiling at them for. A man sitting next to Ford at the bar looked at the two men, looked at the 6 pints, did a swift burst of mental arithmetic, arrived at an answer he liked, and grinned a stupid, hopeful grin at him. "Get off," said Ford. "They're ours," giving him a look that would have made an Algolian sun tiger get on with what it was doing. Ford slapped a £5 note on the bar. He said, "Keep the change." "What, from a fiver? Thank you, sir." "You've got 10 minutes left to spend it." The barman simply decided to walk away for a bit. Ford," said Arthur, "would you please tell me what the hell is going on?" "Oh, drink up," said Ford. "You've got 3 pints to get through." 3 pints, said Arthur, "at lunchtime?" The man next to Ford grinned and nodded happily. Ford ignored him. He said, "Time is an illusion. Lunchtime doubly so." Very deep," said Arthur. "You should send that in to the Reader's Digest. They've got a page for people like you." "Drink up." "Why 3 pints all of a sudden?" "Muscle relaxant. You'll need it." "Muscle relaxant? Muscle relaxant." Arthur stared into his beer. "Did I do anything wrong today?" he said, "or has the world always been like this and I've been too wrapped up in myself to notice?" "All right," said Ford, "I'll try to explain. How long have we known each other?" "How long?" Arthur said. About 5 years, maybe 6, he said. "Most of it seemed to make some kind of sense at the time." "All right," said Ford. "How would you react if I said that I'm not from Guildford at all, but from a rather small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse?" Arthur shrugged in a so-so sort of way. "I don't know," he said, pulling a pint of beer. "Why? Do you think it's the sort of thing you're likely to say?" Ford gave up. It really wasn't worth bothering at the moment, what with the world being about to end. He just said, "Drink up." He added, perfectly factually, "The world's about to end." Arthur gave the rest of the pub another wan smile. The rest of the pub frowned at him. A man waved at him to stop smiling at them and mind his own business. "This must be Thursday," said Arthur to himself, sinking low of his beer. "I never could get the hang of Thursdays."
On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact. Several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings, huge as an office block, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from the star Sol, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow something went unnoticed in Goonhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woomera and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it looked exactly like the sort of thing they'd been searching for years. The only place they registered at all was a small black device called a sub-ether sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness a leather satchel, which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended to be auditioning for stuffed into the top. Besides the sub-ether sensomatic, the scripts had an electromagnetic thumb, a short, squat black rod, smooth and matte, with a couple of flat switches and dials on one end. He had also a device that looked rather like a large electronic calculator. This had about 100 tiny flat press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square, which any one of the million pages could be summoned from a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one reason why the snug plastic cover is fitted into it had the words "Don't Panic" printed on it in large, friendly letters. The other reason was that the device was, in fact, the most remarkable of all books ever to come to the great galaxy from the great publishing corporation of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-submenson electronic component is that if it were printed in the normal form of a book, the interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around. Beneath that in Ford's satchel were a few ballpoints, a notepad, and a large bath towel from Marks and Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has a great practical value. You can wrap it around yourself for warmth as you are bound on cold, moonless Jaglan Beta. You can lie on it in the brilliant marble sand beaches of Sangristia 5, inhaling the heavy sea vapors. You can sleep under it beneath the stars, which shine so readily on the desert world of Karafoon. Use a small mini raft down the slowly heavy river Moth. Waited for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to ward off noxious fumes or avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug blast beast of Troll. A mind-boggling stupid creature. It assumes you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a bush, but very ravenous. You can wave a towel in emergencies as a dress signal, and of course, dry yourself off with it. It still seems to be clean enough, at least. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag, a non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume he has in his possession of a toothbrush, washcloth, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., and so forth. Furthermore, the strag will be happily to lend the hitchhiker any of those or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might have accidentally lost. What would the strag think when they think of any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through and still know where his towel is? Is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence, a phrase that has passed into hitchhiking slang is, "Hey, you sass, that hoopy Ford Perfect? There's a fruit who really knows where his towel is." Sass, translated to mean possibly know, be aware, met, have sex with, hoopy, really together guy, fruit, really amazing together guy. Nestling quietly on top of the towel in Ford Perfect's satchel, the sub-ether sensomatic began to wink more quietly. Miles above the surface of the planet, the huge yellow something began to fan out. At Doradal Bank, someone decided it was time for a nice, relaxing cup of tea. "You got a towel on you?" Ford suddenly asked Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked around him. "Why?" "What? No, why should have?" He had given up being surprised there and didn't seem to point to it any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. "Drink up," he urged. At that moment, a dull sound of rumbling crashed outside, filtered through a low murmur of the pub. Through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over whiskey, Ford eventually had bought him. Arthur choked on his beer and leapt to his feet. "What was that?" he yelped. "Don't worry," Ford said. "They haven't started yet." "Thank God for that," Arthur said and relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down. said Ford, downing his last pint. What? Arthur shouted. Suddenly Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around and ran to the window. My God, they are! They're knocking down my house! What the hell am I doing at the pub, Ford? It hardly makes any difference at this stage, said Ford. Let them have their fun. Fun? Arthur yelled. Fun? He quickly checked out the window again. They were talking about the same thing. Damn, they're fun, he hooted. He ran out of the pub, furiously waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all at the pub that lunchtime. Stop, you vandals, you home wreckers, bawled Arthur. You half-crazed Visigoths, stop, will you? Ford would have to go after him. Quickly turning to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. There you are, sir, said the barman, slacking packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you'd be so kind. Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another 5-pound note, and he told him to keep the change. The barman looked and then looked at Ford and suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary satisfaction he didn't understand because no one on earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny, almost non-noticeable subliminal signal. The signal simply communicates at an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far they are from being from their place of birth. On Earth, it's never possible to be farther than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't very far, so the signal's too minute to be noticed. Ford was at the moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light years away from the near vicinity of the planet Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Perfect with a sense of respect and almost awe. Are you serious, sir? He said with a small whisper, the effect of silence in the pub. Think the world's going to end? Yes, said Ford. Well, this afternoon? Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippest. Yes, he said gaily. In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate. The barman couldn't believe the conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he had either. Is there anything we're supposed to do about it then? No, nothing, said Ford, stuffing the peanuts in his pocket. Someone in the hush bar laughed miraculously at how stupid everything was. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes weaved up the way up to Ford. I thought, he said, the world was going to end. We were meant to lie down and put a paper bag on your head or something. If you like, yes, said Ford. That's what they told us to do in the army, said the man. His eyes began a long track back towards whiskey. Well, said the barman. No, said Ford, and he gave a friendly smile. Excuse me, I've got to go. The way he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassing enough, the man with a rakish laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour, and would probably have been of great satisfaction to her know that in a minute and a half or so, he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she was too busy evaporating herself to notice. When the barman cleared his throat, he heard himself say, last orders, please. The huge yellow machine began to sink downward and move faster. Ford knew what they were. This wasn't the way he wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it suddenly become, and he didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice a sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozer crawling over the rubble that had been his home. You barbarians, he yelled. I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn, and cornered, and whipped, and boiled until you've had enough. Ford was running after him very fast. Very, very fast. And then I'll do it again, yelled Arthur. And when I finish, I'll take the little bits. I will jump on them. Arthur didn't notice the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hysterically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow something was screaming through the clouds. This impossibly huge yellow somethings. And I will carry on jumping on them, yelled Arthur, still running. Until I get blisters, until I think of anything more unpleasant to do, and then Arthur tripped, fell headlong, rolled, and landed flat on his back. At last, he had noticed something was going on. His finger shot upward. "What the hell is that?" he shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in a monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with mind-boggling noise, and leaped off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a bang that drove your ears 6 inches into your skull. Another one followed, and exactly the same thing, only louder. It's difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made any sense. Running to houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the noise. All around the world, cities exploded with people, cars skidded into each other. As the noise fell on them, they rolled off like a tidal wave over hills and valleys, deserts, oceans, seeming to flatten everything in it. Only one man stood by and watched the sky, stood with terrible sadness in his eyes and rubber bungs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and he had known ever since his sub-ether sense-o-matic had started whining the dead of night beside his pillow and wakened him with a start. It was what he had waited for all those years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern, sitting alone in a small dark room, a coldness gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of all the races in all the galaxy, who could have come, said big hello to planet Earth, he thought? Didn't it just have to be the Vogons? Still, he knew what he had to do. As the Vogon craft screamed through the sky and high in the air above him, he opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. He knew where his tower was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything was worse than the noise, it was the silence. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionlessly in the sky over every nation on earth. Motionlessly, they hung huge, heavy, steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden spacious whisper over open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, television, cassette recorder, woofer, tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, dustbin, window, car, wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the Earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction. The great public address system, the greatest ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message.
People of Earth, your attention, please.
A voice said. It was wonderful, wonderful, perfect quadraphonic sound with a distortion level solo to make a brave man weep.
This is Prostanetic Volgon Jeltz of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council.
The voice continued.
As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of hyperspatial express routes through your system. And regrettably, your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you.
The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly. The gathered crowd as if they were iron filings. On a sheet of board, and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again. Desperate fleeing panic. Well, there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned the PA on again. It said,
There's no point in acting surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display at your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for about 50 of your Earth viewers. So you've had plenty of time to lodge a formal complaint. And it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now.
The PA fell silent again, and its echoes drifted across the land. The huge ships turned slowly to the sky with easy power. On the other side of each hatchway opened, an empty black square. By this time, somebody somewhere had managed a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcast a message to the Vogon ships, to plead on behalf of Earth. Nobody ever heard what they said, they only heard the reply. The PA slammed back again to life. There was an annoyed voice that said,
What do you mean they've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sakes, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. Look, I'm sorry, but you can't just be bothered to take interest in local affairs. That's your own lookout. Energized demolition beams.
light poured out of the hatchways.
I don't know, said the voice in the PA. Apathetic, bloody planet. No sympathy at all.
It cut off. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. There was a terrible, ghastly noise. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into an inky, starry void.
Chapter 4. Far away on the opposite spiral arm of the galaxy, 500,000 light years from the star Sol, Zapad Beeblebrox, president of the Imperial Galactic Government, sped across the seas of Demogran, his ion drive delta boat winking and flashing in the Demogran sun. Demogran the hot, Demogran the remote, Demogran the almost totally unheard of. Demogran, secret home of the Heart of Gold. The boat sped on across the water. It would be some time before it reached its destination because Demogran is such an inconceivably arranged planet. It consists of nothing but middling to large desert islands separated by very pretty but annoyingly wide stretches of ocean. The boat sped on. Because of this topographical awkwardness, Demogran has always remained a deserted planet. That's why the Imperial Galactic Government chose Demogran for the Heart of Gold project, because it was so deserted and the Heart of Gold project was so secret. The boat zipped and skipped across the sea that lay between the main islands, the only archipelago of any useful size on the whole planet. Zaphod Beeblebrox was on his way from the tiny spaceport on Easter Island, the name that was an entirely meaningless coincidence. In galactic speak, Easter means small, flat, and light brown. To the Heart of Gold Island, which by another meaningless coincidence was called France. One of the side effects of work in the Heart of Gold was a whole string of pretty meaningless coincidences. But it was not in any way a coincidence that today, the day of accumulation of the project, the great day of unveiling, the day that the Heart of Gold was finally to be introduced to a marveling galaxy, was also a great day of culmination for Zaphod Beeblebrox. It was for the sake of this day that he had first decided to run for the presidency, a decision which had sent shockwaves of astonishment throughout the Imperial Galaxy. Zaphod Beeblebrox, president? Not the Zaphod Beeblebrox, not the president. Many had seen it as a clinching proof that the whole of known creation had finally gone bananas. Zaphod grinned and gave the boat an extra kick of speed. Zaphod Beeblebrox, adventurer, ex-hippie, good timer, crook? Quite possibly. Manic self-publicist, terribly bad at personal relationships. Often thought to be completely out to lunch. President? No one had gone bananas, not in that way at least. Only 6 people in the entire galaxy understood the principle on which the galaxy was governed, and they knew that at once if Beeblebrox had announced his intention to run as president, it was more or less a fait accompli. He was ideal presidency fodder. President. Definition. Full title of President of the Imperial Galactic Government. The term imperial is kept, though now it is now an anachronism. The hereditary emperor is now nearly dead and has been for many centuries. In the last moments of his dying coma, he was locked in a stasis field which keeps him in a state of perpetual unchangingness. All his heirs are now long dead, and this means that without any drastic political upheaval, power has simply and effectively moved a rung or two down the ladder, and is now seen to be vested in a body which used to act simply as advisors to the emperor, an elected governmental assembly headed by a president, elected by that assembly. In fact, it vests in no such place. The president in particular is very much a figurehead. He wields no real power whatsoever. He is apparently chosen by the government, but the qualities he is required to display are not those of leadership, but of those of finely judged outrage. For this reason, the president is always a controversial choice, always an infuriating but fascinating character. His job is not to wield power, but to draw attention away from it. On those criteria, Zaphoi Beeblebrox is one of the most successful presidents of the galaxy has ever had. He has already spent 2 of his 10 presidential years in prison for fraud. Very, very few people realize that the president and the government have virtually no power at all. And of these few people, only 6 know whence ultimate political power is wielded. Most of the others secretly believe that the ultimate decision-making process is handled by a computer. They couldn't be more wrong. What they completely failed to understand was why Zaphod was doing it. He banked sharply, shooting a wild wall of water at the sun. Today was the day. Today was the day when they would realize that what Zaphod had been up to. Today was what Zaphod Beeblebrox's presidency was all about. Today was also his 200th birthday. That was just another meaningless coincidence. As he skipped his boat across the seas of Damagran, he smiled quietly to himself about what a wonderful, exciting day it was going to be. He relaxed and spread his 2 arms lazily along the seat back. He steered with an extra arm he recently had fitted just beneath his right one to help improve his ski boxing. Hey, he cooed to himself, you're a real cowboy, you. But his nerves sang a song shriller than a dog whistle. The island of France, not on Earth, was about 20 miles long, 5 miles across the middle, sandy and crescent-shaped. In fact, it seemed to exist not so much as an island in its own right, as simply a means of defining the sweep and curve of a huge bay. This impression was heightened by the fact that the inner coastline of the crescent consisted almost entirely of steep cliffs. From the top of the cliff, that land sloped slowly down 5 miles to the opposite shore. On top of the cliff stood a reception committee. It consisted in large part of the engineers and researchers who had built the Heart of Gold, mostly humanoid, but here and there were a few reptilioid atomineers. 3 green sylph-like maximegalacticians, an octopodic physiculturalist, or 2, and a huluvu. A huluvu is a super intelligent shade of the color blue, by the way, in case you didn't know. All except the huluvu were resplendent in their multicolored ceremonial lab coats. The huluvu had been temporarily reflected into a freestanding prism for the occasion. There was a mood of immense excitement thrilling through all of them. Together and between them, they had gone to and beyond the furthest limits of physical laws, restructured the fundamental fabric of matter, strained, twisted, and broken the laws of possibility and impossibility, both, by the way. But still, the greatest excitement of all seemed to be to meet a man with an orange sash around his neck. An orange sash was what the president of the galaxy traditionally wore. It might not even have made much difference to them if they had known exactly how much power the president of the galaxy actually wielded. Not at all. Only 6 people in the galaxy knew that the job of the galactic president was not to wield power, but to attract attention away from it. Zaphod Beeblebrox was amazingly good at his job. The crowd gasped, dazzled by sun and seamanship, as the presidential speedboat zipped around the headland into the bay. It flashed and shone as it came skating over the sea in wide, skidding turns. In fact, it didn't need to touch the water at all, because it was supported on a hazy cushion of ionized atoms. But, just for the effect, it was fitted with thin fin blades, which could be lowered into the water. They slashed sheets of water hissing into air, carved deep gashes in the sea, which slayed crazily and sunk back foaming into the boat's wake as it careered across the bay. Zaphod loved effect. It was what he was best at. He twisted the wheel sharply. The boat slewed around in a wild, skiding skid beneath the cliff face and dropped to rest lightly on the rocking waves. Within seconds, he ran on the deck and waved and grinned at over 3 billion people. The 3 billion people weren't actually there, but they watched his every gesture through the eyes of a small robot tri-D camera, which hovered obsequiously in the air nearby. The antics of the president always made amazingly popular tri-D. That's what they were for. He grinned again. 3,000,006 people didn't know it, but today would be a bigger antic than anyone had bargained for. The robot camera honed in for a close-up on the more popular of his 2 heads, and he waved again. He was roughly humanoid in appearance, except for an extra head and 3rd arm. His tousled fair hair had stuck out in random directions, and his blue eyes glinted with something completely unidentifiable, and his chins were almost always unshaven. A 20-foot-high transparent globe floated next to his boat, rolling and bobbing, glistening in the brilliant sun. Inside it floated a wide, semicircular sofa upholstered in glorious red leather. The more the globe bobbed and rolled, the more the sofa stayed perfectly still, steady as an upholstered rock. Again, all done for the effect of it as much as anything. Zaphod stepped through the wall of the globe and relaxed on the sofa. He spread his 2 arms along the back, and with his 3rd brushed some of the dust off his knee. His head slipped about, smiling. He put his feet up. At any moment, he thought he might scream. Water boiled up beneath the bubble. It seethed and spouted. The bubble surged into the air, bobbing and rolling on the water spout. Up it climbed, throwing stilts of light at the cliff. Up it surged on the jet, the water falling from beneath it, crashing back into the sea hundreds of feet below. Zaphod smiled, picturing himself. A thoroughly ridiculous form of transport, but a thoroughly beautiful one. At the top of the cliff, the globe wavered for a moment, tipped onto a railed ramp, rolled down into a small concave platform and riddled to a halt. To tremendous applause, Zaphod Beeblebrox stepped out of the bubble, his orange sash blazing in the light. The president of the galaxy had arrived! He waited for the applause to die down, and then he raised his hand in greeting. "Hi," he said. A government spider sidled up to him and attempted to press a copy of his prepared speech into his hands. Pages 3 to 7 of the original version were at the moment floating soggily on the Damogran Sea, some 5 miles out from the bay. Pages 1 and 2 had been salvaged by a Damogran frond-crested eagle and had already become incorporated into an extraordinarily new form of nest which the eagle had invented. It was constructed largely of papier-mâché, and it was virtually impossible for a newly hatched baby eagle to break out of it. The Damogran frond-crested eagle had heard of the notion of survival of the species, but wanted no truck with it. Zaphod Beeblebrox would not be needing his set speech, and he gently deflected the one being offered to him by the spider. "Hi," he said again. Everyone beamed at him, or at least nearly everyone. He singled out Trillian from the crowd. Trillian was a girl that Zaphod had picked up recently while visiting a planet just for fun, incognito. She was slim, darkish, humanoid with long waves of black hair, a full mouth, an odd little knob of a nose, and ridiculously brown eyes. With her red scarf knotted in that particular way, and her long flowing silky brown dress, she looked vaguely Arabic. Not that anyone there had ever heard of an Arab, of course. The Arabs had very recently ceased to exist, and even when they had existed, they were 500,000 light years from Damogran. Trillian wasn't anyone in particular, or so Zaphod claimed. She just went around him rather a lot and told him what she thought of him. "Hi, honey," he said to her. She flashed him a quick, tight smile and looked away. Then she looked back for a moment and smiled more warmly, but by this time he was looking at something else. "Hi," he said to a small knot of creatures from the press who were standing nearby, wishing that he would stop saying hi and get on with the quotes. He grinned at them, particularly because he knew that in a few moments he would be giving them one hell of a quote. The next thing he said was not a lot of use to them. One of the officials of the party had irritably decided that the president was clearly not in the mood to read the deliciously turned speech that had been written for him, and had flipped the switch on the remote control device in his pocket. Away in front of them, a huge white dome that bulged against the sky cracked down the middle, split, and slowly folded itself down into the ground. Everyone gasped, although they had known perfectly well it was going to do that because they built it that way. Beneath it lay uncovered a huge starship, 150 meters long, shaped like a sleek running shoe, perfectly white and mind-bogglingly beautiful. At the heart of it, unseen, lay a small gold box which carried within it the most brain-wrenching device ever conceived. A device which made this starship unique in the history of the galaxy. A device after which the ship had been named, the Heart of Gold. "Wow. Wow," said Zaphod Beeblebrox to the Heart of Gold. There wasn't much else he could say. He said it again, because he knew it would annoy the press. "Wow." The crowd turned their faces back toward him expectantly. He winked at Trillian, who raised her eyebrows and widened her eyes at him. She knew what he was about to say, and thought him a terrible show-off. "That is really amazing," he said. "That really is truly amazing. That is so amazingly amazing. I think I'd like to steal it." A marvelous presidential quote, absolutely true to form. The crowd laughed appreciatively. The newsmen gleefully punched buttons in their sub-epinewsmatics, and the president grinned. As he grinned, his heart screamed unbearably, and he figured the small paralysomatic bomb that nestled quietly in his pocket. Finally, he could bear no more. He lifted his heads up to the sky, let out a wild whoop in major third, threw the bomb to the ground and ran forward through the sea of the suddenly frozen, beaming smiles.
Prostetnik Vogan Jeltz was not a pleasant sight, even for other Vogons. His highly domed nose rose high above a small piggy forehead. His dark green rubbery skin was thick enough for him to play the game of Vogon civil service politics, and play it well, and waterproof enough for him to serve indefinitely at sea depths of down to 1,000 feet, with no ill effects. Not that he ever went swimming, of course. His busy schedule would not allow it. He was the way he was because billions of years ago, when the Vogons had first crawled out of their sluggish primeval seas of Vogsphere, and had lain panting and heaving on the planet's virgin shores, when the first rays of the bright young Vogsol's sun had shone across them that morning, it was as if the forces of evolution had simply given up on them, and there and then had turned aside in disgust and written them off as an ugly and unfortunate mistake. They never evolved again. They should never have survived. The fact that they did is some kind of tribute to the thick-willed, slug-brained stubbornness of these creatures. Evolution, they said to themselves. Who needs it? And what nature refused to do for them, they simply did without until such time came that they were able to rectify the gross anatomical inconveniences with surgery. Meanwhile, the natural forces of the planet Vogsphere had been working overtime to make up their earlier blunder. They brought forth scintillating, jeweled, scuttling crabs, which the Vogons ate, smashing their shells with iron mallets, tall, aspiring trees of breathtaking slenderness and color, which the Vogons cut down and burned the crab meat with, elegant gazelle-like creatures with silken coats and dewy eyes, which the Vogons could catch and sit on. They were no use as transport because their backs would snap instantly, but the Vogons sat on them anyway. Thus the planet Vogsphere whiled away the unhappy millennia until the Vogons suddenly discovered the principles of interstellar travel. Within a few short Vogue years, every last Vogon had migrated from the Megabrantis cluster, the political hub of the galaxy, and now formed the immensely powerful backbone of the Galactic Civil Service. They have attempted to acquire learning. They have attempted to acquire style and social graces. But in most respects, the modern Vogon is little different from his primitive forebears. Every year they import 27,000 scintillating jeweled scuttling crabs from their native planet and while away a happy drunken night, smashing them to bits with iron mallets. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was a fairly typical Vogon in that he was thoroughly vile. Also, he did not like hitchhikers. Somewhere in a small dark cabin buried in the intestines of Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz's flagship, a small match flared nervously. The owner of the match was not a Vogon, but he knew all about them and was right to be nervous. His name was Ford Prefect. Ford's original name is only pronounceable in the obscure Betelgeusian dialect, now virtually extinct since the great collapsing Hrung disaster of Gal Sid year 03758, which wiped out all of the Praxabetal communities on Betelgeuse 7. Ford's father was the only man on the entire planet to survive the great collapsing Hrung disaster by an extraordinary coincidence that he was never able to satisfactorily explain. The whole episode is shrouded in deep mystery. In fact, no one ever knew that Hrung was nor why it was chosen to collapse on Betelgeuse 7 particularly. Ford's father, magnanimously waving aside the clouds of suspicion that had inevitably settled around him, came to live on Betelgeuse 5, where he both fathered and uncled Ford. In memory of his now dead race, he christened him with the ancient Praxabetal tongue. Because Ford never learned to say his original name, his father eventually died of shame, which is still a terminal disease in some parts of the galaxy. The other kids at school nicknamed him Ix, which in the language of Betelgeuse 5 translates as boy who is not able to satisfactorily to explain why Hrung is, nor why it should choose to collapse on Betelgeuse 7. He looked about the cabin, but could see very little. Strange, monstrous shadows loomed and leaped with the tiny flickering flame, but all was quiet. He breathed a silent thank you to the Dentraces. The Dentraces are an unruly tribe of Gormons, a wild but pleasant bunch whom the Vogons had recently taken to employing as catering staff on their long-haul fleets, on the strict understanding that they keep themselves very much to themselves. This suited the Dentraces fine because they loved Vogon money, which is one of the hardest currencies in space, but loathed the Vogons themselves. The only sort of Vogon the Dentreci like to see was an annoyed Vogon. It was because of this tiny piece of information that Ford Prefect was not now a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. He heard a slight groan. By the light of the match, he saw a heavy shape, moving slightly on the floor. Quickly, he took the match out, reached into his pocket, found what he was looking for, and took it out. He ripped it open and shook it. He crouched on the floor. The shape moved again. Ford Prefect said, "I brought you some peanuts." Arthur Dent moved and groaned again, muttering incoherently.
Here, have some, urged Ford, shaking the packet again. If you've never been through a matter transference beam before, you've probably lost some salt and protein. The beer you had should have cushioned your system just a bit.
Said Arthur Dent. His eyes opened. "It's dark," he said.
Yes, it's dark.
No light. Dark. No light. One of the things Fort Prefect had always found hardest to understand about humans was their habit of continually stating and repeating the very, very obvious. As in, it's a nice day, or you're very tall, or oh dear, you seem to have fallen down a 30-foot well. Are you all right? At first, Ford formed a theory to account for this strange behavior. If human beings don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their mouths would probably seize up. After a few months' consideration and observation, he abandoned this theory in favor of a new one. If they don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their brains start working. After a while, he abandoned this one as well, being obstructively cynical, and decided he quite liked human beings after all, but he always remained desperately worried about the terrible number of things that they didn't know about.
Yes, he agreed with Arthur. No light. He helped Arthur to some peanuts. How do you feel?
Like a military academy. Bits of me keep passing out. Ford stared at him blankly in darkness. If I asked you where the hell we were, would you regret it?
Ford stood up and said, We're safe.
Oh, good, said Arthur.
We're in a small galley cabin at one of the spaceships of the Vogon constructor fleet.
Ah. This is obviously some strange usage of the word safe that I wasn't previously aware of. Ford struck another match to help him search for a light switch. Monstrous shadows leaped and loomed again. Arthur struggled to his feet and hugged himself apprehensively. Hideous alien shapes seemed to throng about him. The air was thick with musty smells which sidled into his lungs without identifying themselves, and a low, irritating hum kept his brain from focusing. How did we get here? He asked, shivering slightly.
We hitched a lift, said Ford.
Excuse me? Are you trying to tell me that we just stuck out our thumbs and some green-eyed monster stuck his head out and said, Hi, fellas, hop right in. I can take you as far as the Basingstoke roundabout.
Well, said Ford, the thumb's an electronic sub-ether signaling device, and the roundabout's at Bernard's Star, 6 light years away. But otherwise, yeah, that's more or less right.
And the bug-eyed monsters?
It's green, yes.
Fine, said Arthur. Can I go home?
You can't.
Said Ford Prefect, and found the light switch.
Shade your eyes.
He said and handed on. Even Ford was surprised. Good grief, said Arthur. Is this really the interior of a flying saucer? Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz heaved his unpleasant green body round the control bridge. He always felt vaguely irritable after demolishing populated planets. He wished that someone would come and tell him that it was all wrong, and so that he could shout at them and feel better. He flopped as heavily as he could onto the control seat in the hope that it would break and give him something to be genuinely angry about, but it only gave a complaining sort of creak. Go away! He shouted at a young Vogon guard who entered the bridge at that moment. The guard vanished immediately, feeling rather relieved. He was glad it wouldn't now be him who had delivered the report they'd just received. The report was an official release, which said that a wonderful new form of spaceship drive was at this moment being unveiled at a government research base on Damagran, which would henceforth make all hyperspatial express routes unnecessary. Another door slid open, but this time the Vogon captain didn't shout because it was the door from the galley quarters where the Dentrasis prepared his meals. A meal would be most welcome. A huge furry creature bounded through the door with his lunch tray. It was grinning like a maniac. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was delighted. He knew that when a Dentrasi looked that pleased with itself, there was something going on somewhere on the ship, and he could get very angry about it indeed. Ford and Arthur stared around them.
Well, what do you think?
It's a bit squalid, isn't it? Ford frowned at the grubby mattresses, unwashed cups, and unidentifiable bits of smelly alien underwear that lay around the cramped cabin.
Well, this is a working ship, you see. These are the Dentrasi's sleeping quarters.
I thought you said they were called Vogons or something.
Oh, yes. The Vogons run the ship, the Dentrosies are just the cooks. They let us on board.
I'm so confused, said Arthur.
Here, take a look at this, said Ford.
He sat down on one of the mattresses and rummaged about in his satchel. Arthur prodded the mattress nervously and then sat on it himself. In fact, he had very little to be nervous about because all the mattresses grown in the swamps of Scorchellus Zeta were thoroughly killed and dried before being put to service. Very few have ever come to life again. Ford handed the book to Arthur. What is it? Asked Arthur.
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of electronic book. It tells you everything you need to know about anything. That's its job.
Arthur turned it over nervously in his hands. I like the cover, he said. Don't panic. It's the first helpful or intelligible thing anybody's said to me all day.
I'll show you how it works, said Ford.
He snatched it from Arthur, who was still holding it as if it were a 2-week dead lark, and pulled it out of its cover.
You press this button here, you see, and the screen lights up, giving you the index.
A screen about 3 inches by 4 lit up and characters began to flicker across the surface.
You want to know about the Vogon, so I entered that name. And here we are,
He said as his fingers tapped across the keys. The words Vogon Constructor Fleet flared in green across the screen. Ford pressed a red button on the bottom of the screen and the words began to undulate across it. At the same time, the book began to speak the entry as well in a still, quiet, measured voice. This is what the book said. Vogon Constructor Fleets. Here's what to do if you want to get a gift from a Vogon. Forget it. They are one of the most unpleasant races in the galaxy. Not actually evil, but bad-tempered, bureaucratic, officious, and callous. They wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug-bladdered beast of Trawl without orders signed in triplicate, sent in, sent back, queried, lost, found, subjected to library inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in soft peat for 3 months and recycled as firelighters. The best way to get a drink out of a Vogon is to stick your finger down his throat, and the best way to irritate him is to feed his grandmother to the ravenous bug-bladdered beast of Trawl. On no account allow a Vogon to read poetry to you. Arthur blinked at it. What a strange book! How did we get a lift then?
That's the point. It's out of date now, said Ford, sliding the book back into its cover. I'm doing the field research for the new revised edition, and one of the things I'll have to do is include this bit about how Vogons now employ Dendrasi cooks, which gives us a rather useful little loophole.
A pained expression crossed Arthur's face. Who are the Dendrasis? He said.
Great guys. They're the best cooks and the best drink mixers, and they don't get a wet slap about anything else. They'll always help hitchhikers aboard, partly because they like the company, but mostly because it annoys the Vogons, which is exactly the sort of thing you need to know if you're the impoverished hitchhiker trying to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. And that's my job. Fun, isn't it?
Arthur looked lost. It's amazing, he said, and frowned at one of the other mattresses.
Unfortunately, I got stuck on Earth for rather longer than I intended, said Ford. I came back for a week and got stuck for 15 years.
But how did you get there in the first place then?
Easy. I got a lift with a teaser.
A teaser?
Teaser, yeah.
What is
A teaser? Teasers are usually rich kids with nothing to do. They cruise around looking for planets that haven't made interstellar contact yet, and they kind of buzz them.
buzz them? Arthur began to feel Ford was enjoying making life difficult for him.
Yeah, they buzz them. They find some isolated spot with very few people around, and land right by some poor unsuspecting soul whom no one's ever going to believe, and then strut up and down in front of him, wearing silly antennae on their heads and making beep beep noises. Rather childish, really.
Ford leaned back on the mattress with his hands behind his head and looked infuriatingly pleased with himself. Ford, insisted Arthur, I don't know if this sounds like a silly question, but, what am I doing here?
Well, you know that. I rescued you from Earth.
And what's happened to Earth?
Oh, it's been demolished.
Has it? Said Arthur levelly.
Yes, it just bowled away into space.
I'm a bit upset about that.
Ford frowned to himself and seemed to roll the thought around in his mind. Yeah, I can understand that.
Understand that? Shouted Arthur. Understand?
Ford sprang up. Keep looking at the book, he hissed urgently.
What?
Don't panic.
I'm not panicking!
Yes, you are.
All right, so I am panicking. What else is there to do?
You just come along with me and have a good time. The galaxy's a fun place. You'll need to have this fish in your car.
I beg your pardon, asked Arthur, rather politely, he thought.
Ford was holding up a small glass jar which quite clearly had a small yellow fish wriggling around inside of it. Arthur blinked at him. He wished there was something simple and recognizable he could grasp hold of. He would have felt safe alongside the Dentrosi's underwear, the piles of scorned-shellus mattresses, and the man from Beetlejuice holding up the small yellow fish and offering to put it in his ear. He had been able to see just a small packet of cornflakes, but he couldn't, and he didn't feel safe. Suddenly, a violent noise leaped at them from no source that he could identify. He gasped in terror at what sounded like a man trying to gargle while fighting off a pack of wolves.
Hush, said Ford.
Listen, it might be important.
Important?
It's the Vogon captain making an announcement to the Tannoy.
You mean that's how Vogons talk?
Listen,
I can't speak Vogon.
you don't need to. Just put this fish in your ear.
Ford, with a lightning movement, clapped his hand to Arthur's ear, and he had the sudden sickening sensation of the fifth slithering deep into his oral tract. Gasping with horror, he scrambled at his ear for just a second or so, but then slowly turned, goggle-eyed with wonder. He was experiencing the oral equivalent of looking at a picture of two black silhouetted faces and suddenly seeing it as a picture of a white candlestick, or of looking at a lot of colored dots on a piece of paper which suddenly resolve themselves into the figure 6, and mean that your optician is going to charge you a lot of money for a new pair of glasses. He was still listening to the howling gargles. He knew that. Only now, it had somehow taken on some semblance of perfectly straightforward English. And this is what he heard.
Chapter 6.
How, gargle, how, gargle, how, gargle, how, gargle, how, gargle, girl, how, gargle, how, slip.
Should have a good time. Message repeats. This is your captain speaking, so stop whatever you are doing and pay attention. First of all, I see from our instruments that we have a couple of hitchhikers aboard. Hello, whoever you are. I just want to make it totally clear that you are not at all welcome. I worked hard to get where I am today, and I didn't become captain of a Vogon constructor ship simply so I could turn it into a taxi service for a load of degenerate freeloaders. I am sent out a search party, and as soon as they find you, I will put you off the ship. If you're very lucky, I might read you some of my poetry first. Secondly, we are about to jump into hyperspace from the journey through Barnard's star. On arrival, we will stay in dock for a 72-hour refit, and no one's to leave the ship during that time. I repeat, all planet leave is cancelled. I've just had an unhappy love affair, so I don't know why anybody else should have a good time. Message ends. The noise stopped. Arthur discovered to his embarrassment that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor with his arms wrapped around his head. He smiled weakly. Charming man, he said. I wish I had a daughter so I could forbid her to marry one. Oh, you were NATO, said Ford. They've got about as much sex appeal as a road accident. No, don't move, he said, as Arthur began to uncurl himself. You'd better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk. What's so unpleasant about being drunk? You ask a glass of water. Arthur thought about this. Ford? Yeah? What's this fish doing in my ear? It's translating for you. It's a babblefish. Look it up in the book if you like. He tossed over the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then curled himself up into a fetal ball to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment, the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out. His feet began to leak out the top of his head. The room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, and left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. The babblefish said the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, is small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech sensors of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all this is that if you stick a babblefish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix which has been fed into your mind by your babblefish. Now it is such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. I refuse to prove that I exist, said God, for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing. But, says man, the babblefish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, and so therefore by your own arguments you don't. QED. Oh dear, says God, I hadn't thought of that, and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. Oh, that was easy, said man, and for an encore goes on to prove that black is white and gets himself killed on the next pedestrian crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of dingo's kidneys, but that didn't stop Olan Colafid making a small fortune when he used it as a central theme of his best-selling book, Well, that about wraps it up for God. Meanwhile, the poor babblefish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick throughout hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years away from the place that the Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. Visions of it swam sickeningly through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole Earth being gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking that his parents and his sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he had been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of a complete stranger he had been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before and felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there would be no outcry because there was no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind. His mind stuck here in this dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He got that. Somehow he got that. He tried again. America, he thought, has gone. He couldn't grasp it. He started to start smaller again. New York has gone. No reaction. He never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought. There is no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came round a second later, he found he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford! Ford looked up from where he was sitting in a corner, humming to himself. He always found the actual traveling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah, he said. If you're a researcher on this book thing and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yes. Let me see what it says in this edition then. I've got to see it. Oh yeah, okay. He passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hand shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at him. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Oh yeah, it does, he said. Down there, see at the bottom of the screen, just before eccentric Galumpitz, the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw whether it was pointing. But for a moment it still didn't register. Then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? That's all it's got to say? Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors, he said, and no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, well, yeah, I managed to transmit a new entry off it to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless, shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Hissed Arthur. It was me shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble? Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. The dentresses, whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tipped boots, said Ford. There was a sharp, ringing rap on the door. Then who is it? Said Arthur. Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky? If we're unlucky, said Ford grimly, the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read us some of his poetry first.
Well, folks, as you see, the Vogons are about to find our intrepid hitchhikers, and we have to leave it here. So please, feel free to check out a copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You can find a copy available here at the Montgomery City County Public Library. And this has been Mike Breen,
Will Byrne, Robert
Claire.
Tobias. Sorry?
Emma Claire.
And Robert Tobias.
This is Classic Scott, and we're cutting out.